This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. I think this last presidential campaign brought a wider recognition of just how deeply unfair our society is. More than 10 years ago, Andrew Friedman went to the Bushwick section of Brooklyn to help found an organization that helps the powerless to become more powerful. That organization has flourished, and now his efforts are directed across the country. He's my guest today. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we talked about it when you first started, or early days of Make the Road by Walking.
Yep.
And then it became Make the Road New York. And it's now a very powerful organization, isn't it?
It really has grown. And I mean, I think in some ways, the last 15 years have really been a quest to kind of build the scale that we need. Mm-hmm. First, in New York City, then in New York State, and now kind of the Center for Popular Democracy, which I just helped found 8 months ago, is really about trying to build power across the country and in partnership with kind of base building organizations like Make the Road all over the place. And I think it's really trying to create a new paradigm of community organizing that is not just about mobilizing people, but really about engaging them, building community that folks find both nourishing and also kind of helps them find kind of both courage and energy to challenge inequity.
When you talk about the community, what do you mean? That it's not just about action, but it's what the community needs, what their needs are, what they want.
I think it's certainly all of those things. I guess, often community organizing at its worst can be about kind of moving bodies, right? Mobilizing people to direct action, challenging injustice, which is not a bad thing. It's often a very good, important, powerful thing, and often by just participating in direct action protest, you
brought some change, right?
You help catalyze change, and it's often transformative for you personally. Certainly what I found at Make the Road is there were concrete injustices that we sought to address or challenge.
Like what?
Like vast income equality here in New York City, routine wage theft, mistreatment of tenants, of low-income people of color by police, right? A range of problems, and but there was also kind of a deeper isolation or alienation that folks felt because they didn't have kind of dynamic, supportive kind of communities that they felt part of, I think particularly in the immigrant community here in the city. And so part of what's unique about Make the Road New York's organizing model is the real emphasis on kind of bringing people into community centers, building a network of really deep, sustaining relationships among kind of activists in different neighborhoods of New York City.
So would it go something like this, that a landlord comes to a tenant and says, I'd like to, make a deal. I offer you $2,500 or $3,000 if you leave and move someplace else, and that person has no one to talk to about that and is left alone to make that decision and frequently does something that is not to their benefit.
Not in their interest.
Yeah.
And often it's much worse than that, right? It's more like a landlord saying, you had someone spend the night at your apartment this week, and that's illegal in New York, and I want you out by Friday, or even worse, they just padlock the door. And so
that happens.
That happens with some level of frequency throughout the city. And so folks are very vulnerable and very alone often. And so getting them engaged in kind of community organizing and in building real kind of collective power with their neighbors and with folks from around the city is one thing, but I think the way that work happens is so important. And I think that what's unique about Make the Road New York has been the emphasis on bringing people together for lots of meetings, which is tiring and challenging and complicated, and there's lots of interpersonal dynamics to navigate. But kind of at its core, what's happening is a fabric of relationships is being built, and it's a much more resilient fabric of relationships than kind of the traditional community organizer knocks on people's doors and then calls them when they need them to move to an action.
Here in front of so much.
Exactly. And you have a tremendous opportunity when folks are spending hours in a shared space every week to do leadership development, to do political education, to help respond to some of the stuff that's personal in nature, not political. Someone's mother gets sick in Mexico, but suddenly they have a community of folks to help lend them a little bit of money or support them as they're going through that. And so their involvement with the organization and with the larger struggle for justice can be sustained as opposed to kind of being snuffed out by a personal challenge.
Right. So now when building that, you realized that it's more than just calling a meeting or having people come. I mean, there are ways of running an organization that really makes it more effective.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that when
you call it infrastructure.
Infrastructure, exactly. Well, when we started Make the Road, we were a lot younger. We had, in some ways, kind of what's most important. We had some hustle. We had a lot of love, and so we brought that to the table. But what we didn't have was a lot of experience. We didn't have a lot of infrastructure, and so everything took a lot longer. We often we couldn't mobilize in the way that we needed to mobilize. Trying to build up scale and efficiency in our work was a real challenge. And so over the years, as Make the Road grew to where it is today, where it's got, between the C3 and the C4 organization, over 20,000 members, a staff of about 100 people, we learned a tremendous amount about, infrastructure, training, databases. And what we found is it makes an enormous difference in our ability to do the work, right? It's not because databases matter in and of themselves, but when you're actually trying to stay in touch with people and you're trying to look at people's kind of leadership trajectory over time, it's important to know what folks are actually doing. And so we saw that as we got better at kind of some of that stuff, our impact got greater. And so I think out of that grew a real commitment to help develop some level of sophisticated infrastructure kind of more broadly in the way that, an SCIU local has tremendous infrastructure that we lacked for more than a decade at Make the Road. And as we developed it, we got stronger. And so now at the Center for Popular Democracy, we really want to help share some of the stuff that we learned about putting together good infrastructure, staff supervision, work planning, evaluation, stuff that is very unsexy compared to storming the barricades and fighting for justice, but I think really important.
Am I wrong, do you think, or do you know? It seems to me there's more community organizing across the country than there used to be.
My sense is I'm not 100% sure. I've been very focused on New York up until about 9 months ago. But what I think is definitely true is that there's more independent community organizing happening now than ever before, partly because some of the centralization, the very large and powerful networks, whether it's the Industrial Areas Foundation or ACORN, have receded in terms of their dominance, and there's been a lot of new organizing in kind of emerging immigrants communities. You've got a lot more powerful communities of color in major metropolitan areas, and then you've got parts of the country where there have historically not been lots of immigrants now becoming very, very immigrant, and so you've got a flourishing of new community organizing efforts and efforts to kind of really capitalize on emerging political power.
So they become more relevant to the communities that they're doing. I mean, it's not, as you said before, calling everybody to a demonstration or something like that. This is going to be around their own agenda that reflects their needs.
I mean, ideally, I think there's lots of different models of community organizing. There's community organizing work that really aims to organize community institutions. There's lots of direct one-on-one community organizing work. And then even within the work with individuals, there's lots of different models, right? Some models focus more on leadership development, others more on mobilization and action. And so it's been a very rich experience for me getting to kind of travel the country now and see some of the really interesting points of dynamism up in outside of Portland in Oregon. There's a very strong farm worker organization. Visiting folks outside of Los Angeles who are trying to organize warehouse workers who are moving all the products that we're buying at Target and at Costco. So it's been a terrific learning experience.
That is that, and in New York too. I mean, we're getting more specific, aren't we? I mean, the living wage bills and the attempt to begin to organize the fast food workers. It's all.
I think that's true. I mean, it's a period.
People have had it.
Well, I mean, I would like to. I hope so. I mean, folks should have had enough with the grotesque inequity of our society. I think that, if you talk to a good activist or organizer at any time, right, the revolution is about to come. So I don't want to kind of say that that's definitely the case, but I think that we're at an important moment, and I think there's, again, lots of dynamic efforts to challenge, exploitation, inequality, racial inequity, and so, I think that part of what I hope to do is help folks succeed in that work.
But when you say the revolution, you don't mean really an overthrow of the government. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know, is the goal not for people to find the way to really have an impact on the government and to become part of the government. I mean, that's the most important thing, isn't it?
Sure. I mean,
I know. I'm only afraid.
No, but I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to clarify. I mean, I think really what I'm saying is that the goal is for folks to participate in a society of equals where their aspirations are as honored as everyone else's aspirations, and their children are as likely to be able to realize their dreams as anyone else's children.
And every day brings another example of how unfair the world is, right? It's either real estate or finance and the ways they don't have to pay taxes or do all these things. And this,
I think that's true. I mean, and so I think really our challenge is to not bemoan inequity, but to really look for concrete things that we can do, whether it's in the workplace or in the buildings where folks are living at in Brooklyn, or legislatively, right? With regards to the minimum wage or living wage legislation, or efforts to challenge federal immigration enforcement or to challenge stop and frisk policies here in New York City. There's a tremendous amount of work that we can and should be doing, and again, we've got to do that work with a high degree of competence to make it successful. Yeah. Exactly.
You're doing a lot of work with immigrant groups and immigrant communities?
We are.
And they're all over the country? All
over the country. I mean, in places that you might not imagine large and thriving immigrant communities. Delaware, right, in Connecticut is a tremendous, growing and powerful immigrant community in most of the major cities in Connecticut.
Are they mixed heritages, or are they mostly the same?
Well, I think it's a combination. There are many, many mixed families all over this country, and then both like my own children who are half Colombian and half American, but also folks with parents from different countries in Latin America or from different parts of the world. But I think that what is clear is the issues of immigration and the issues of racial equality are really not unique to any part of the country at this point in time. These are issues that matter everywhere, and increasingly so.
And everybody is impacted by current policies, I guess. Or some of them.
I think that's really true. I mean, I think in fact, we are all impacted by immigration policies, even in places like Maine, where there are not a ton of immigrants, but there's a Somali workforce in Bar Harbor, and immigration policy matters to everyone because really it's about the economy in this country. And
watching these communities grow is very interesting, isn't it? Because it means somebody went there and then friends and relatives joined them. Is that, when I asked before, I mean, in a community, does it have Eastern European and Latino together, or they tend to be more Latino and, yeah?
No, I mean, again, it varies widely, and it varies by city. I think that, it's not altogether dissimilar from New York, where you've got
That's
Russian
different place.
neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, and then you've got neighborhoods where there's really a wide range of immigrants from kind of lots of parts of the world right on top of each other.
The immigration, the stopping and picking people up, I don't know how to say it nicely. Deportation is not only federal, is it? It's local communities too?
Well, so it's
complicated
interesting. It's very complicated. I think that what we've seen traditionally, immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility. But what we've seen as the federal government has become increasingly aggressive at targeting immigrants for deportation, they've increasingly leaned on and tried to coerce local government to help them in a number of ways, either by deputizing local police forces or asking local departments of corrections or police to help identify and detain folks for deportation. It's been a huge issue here in New York, and working with a number of community organizations here and working with the Speaker of the City Council and the Mayor, we've been pretty successful at getting New York to say to the federal government, you know what? The well-being of New York City depends on creating kind of an open door between the folks who live in New York and the government of New York. We want immigrants to feel comfortable calling the police if they're victims of domestic violence or going to seek health care at public hospitals. And it's not in our interest to burn these relationships and have folks feeling afraid of the government.
Wasn't there recently some kind of an announcement that they were only going to really pursue people who have criminal records or criminal?
So the federal government said that
beginning to pull back?
it has said that they will do just that they will focus on folks who they deem a threat to public safety. Now, unfortunately, they've said this before, and in practice, they haven't really focused their enforcement activities on just folks who are engaged in criminal activity. And so what New York City has done, I think very intelligently, has said, regardless of what federal policy is, we won't spend New York City money to detain immigrants for the federal government who are not threats to public safety, who are not engaged in any dangerous activities. And just recently, Speaker Quinn has announced that she's going to expand on some legislation that was passed last year to say that that the New York City Police Department will also not cooperate in the same way.
So if we're in a local community organization, what do we do about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's, what happened in New York is increasingly members of local community organizations like Make the Road New York, but many others and churches around the city, folks said that they felt afraid of the police. And so in conversation, folks said, well, why? They said, well, because my sister, when she called about a domestic violence situation, the police came. As a matter of course, they arrest both people and say, we'll sort it out at the precinct. She went to the precinct. They realized, oh, it's not her, it's him. But she's at the precinct. They've now, their fingerprints get sent to the FBI. As a matter of course, the FBI now shares those fingerprints with the Department of Homeland Security, and she might never leave the precinct house. And so folks were saying this is a problem. And so they started working with us and some folks at the Immigration Justice Clinic at Cardozo Law School to figure out what is it that the city can do to push back on the federal government's kind of no discretion, aggressive enforcement policies. And that's when we drafted this legislation, which Councilmember Melissa Mark Viverito introduced and was passed into law last year and now is being expanded
So
upon.
a similar way would be done in a community in, I don't know, Arkansas?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what we see is, and this is really part of the idea behind the Center for Popular Democracy, is there's really no reason to be reinventing the wheel in all around the country simultaneously. If we've done something that was innovative or smart in New York City, we should share that with folks in Los Angeles and Chicago and San Diego. And similarly, folks around the country are having great ideas, which we've never thought of here in New York. And so the aspiration of the Center for Popular Democracy is really to serve as kind of connective tissue between all of these dynamic, innovative community organizing forces and trying to really replicate the things that have worked anywhere, everywhere.
Do most law schools now have clinics or groups working on these issues?
Well, so most law schools probably don't. I think here in New York City, we've got a bunch of terrific clinical law programs at NYU, at Columbia, at Cardozo, and we're working with all three of those law schools on kind of to co-teach clinics and then work with students who do, 15 hours or so of field work every week, kind of lending support to all of these community organizing outfits all over the country. I think sadly, that level of commitment to community-based lawyering and policy innovation, particularly state and local policy innovation, is really not the norm at law schools throughout the country. But
Well, isn't that a good subject to go after?
Absolutely.
It would really be interesting. Yeah.
terrific.
Yeah.
No, and there's a real opportunity. I think that, the folks in law school are eager for this kind of real world learning opportunities. There's obviously a tremendous amount of need.
And so important,
Absolutely.
Yeah. You talked about the group in Oregon. Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So it's an organization, it's basically the United Farm Workers equivalent up in rural Oregon. It's called PCUN. It's a farm workers union, but they have kind of generated over the last 35 years about 8 different community organizing groups. They have a housing development corporation, they have an immigrants' rights coalition, they have a radio station called Radio Movimiento that they use to communicate with folks throughout rural Oregon. And it's just a terrific bunch of people engaging with recent immigrants, mostly from Mexico, but from other parts of Latin America as well. And it, really very similar to Make the Road New York in that they're trying to build political power where there needs to be political power that folks can exercise to try and promote access to driver's license and equal access to quality education and to challenge wage theft and other things.
When you talk about wage theft, do you mean
The failure to pay
underpaying?
minimum wage or overtime.
Right. It's a great way of saying it.
It feels like it gets kind of more to the point. I think we probably owe it to the folks at Interfaith Worker Justice in Chicago, probably innovated.
See,
the
that's
term.
how it
Yeah.
spreads. When we were talking and when I was thinking about this, all I can remember is Giuliani and Sarah Palin making so much fun of Obama being a community worker 4 years ago. Do you remember that? Did you ever?
Yeah, of course.
Was that not something that, I just love it. So then we come 4 years later and the headlines are something like, Obama's groundwork beats Romney's PAC money or some such thing. So do they get the idea?
It's an interesting question, and I think it was disheartening because it's really offensive, the notion that trying to involve regular people in politics, in building stronger communities, in envisioning what a better future might look like, and then taking action to realize that better future. It's so grotesque, the notion that is in some ways a silly endeavor.
Discarded. Yeah.
But I think also it shows, it's a problem for them if they don't have their chops in order, right? If they can't build a field operation and they can't have conversations with folks. I think that what we found is that doing the work of building real relationships talking to real people and getting out there and rolling up your sleeves is far more effective than
It's
TV
so
ads.
interesting because you take the combination of the lack of Latino votes or African American votes for Romney and the whole criticism that they aren't relating to the new populations in this country, and then the fact of the ridicule of the community. I mean, that's the future, and they are not realizing it yet.
Right, I think there's no question where we as a country are going demographically, and I think the Republicans ignore that reality at their peril, and I think what we're seeing now is an attempt to kind of be conciliatory on the cheap and do something, anything on immigration, and I think that the challenge for community organizing groups and for immigrant communities is to demand a good deal and to demand real inclusion and real equity and real opportunity, not just...
And it's starting at a real local level, because I mean, with the voting has all been determined by state legislatures. Right? From, you know, the census comes at the end of a decade, and then they redraw the lines and everything else, and that's where people have to find the power to exert it to balance what the efforts have been in the past.
Right. I mean, I think there's
Right.
electoral power, which
Yeah.
is incredibly important. You know, before we started taping, we were talking about some of our voter education and mobilization efforts in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. So that's one kind of power. But the reality is folks can exercise political power in a number of different ways, you know, beyond electoral participation, or even as an undocumented person,
Yeah.
you know, trying to knock on doors and talk to your neighbors about important electoral decisions. And certainly we're trying to push for a kind of a more full and vibrant political participation than just electoral.
Right. We have to, I mean, life is political. It's
Right.
all about politics.
Right.
Whether a kid has the power to eat the spinach or whatever it is, it's always there, and it's techniques and an awareness of how you can do these things.
How you can do these things and how to think strategically and how to identify other people's interests and find common cause with folks. And again, it really does, at the end of the day, it feels like it boils down to you know, a real creativity and a real commitment to listen and work with other people.
Well, Andrew Friedman, we've come to the end of our program, but we are so lucky to have people like you working, and I hope that you will bring all these ideas to each other all across the country, and we'll see great changes in the way people live.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Thank you. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.